afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Limerick Literary Festival in honour of Kate O'Brien. This is the final event of the weekend and the presentation of the Kate O'Brien Award. It's the 7th year of the Kate O'Brien Award, which is presented to the best debut novel or short story collection by an Irish female writer. The award comes with a €2,000 prize, very generously sponsored by Bill and Denise Whelan. This is a wonderful gift, as it not only gives financial support to debut writers, but also adds to the significance of the prize, making it a very important one to aim for. Thank you, Bill and Denise, most sincerely. The first winner in 2015 was Martine Madden for her novel Eniush, published by Brandon, an imprint of O'Brien Books. 2016's winner was Sarah Bohm for Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither, published by Tramp Press. 2017 was When Black Dogs Sing by Tanya Farrelly, published by Ireland House. 2018 was Harvesting by Lisa Harding, published by New Island. 2019, Sue Rainsford for Follow Me to Ground, published by New Island. And last year's winner was Nicole Flattery for Show Them a Good Time, published by The Stinging Fly. This year we had 13 high-quality entries reflecting the strength of women's writing today. We made a short list of 6 instead of the usual 4 because the standard was so high. The shortlisted novels are This Happy by Neve Campbell, The Temple House Vanishing by Rachel Donahue, As You Were by Elaine Feeney, Big Girl Small Town by Michelle Gallen, A Quiet Tide by Marianne Lee, Una by Alice Lyons. These are polished novels in different genres. Each one has a unique voice. Neve Campbell's This Happy is a darkly romantic novel in which the narrator looks back on an affair which continues to haunt her. I have taken apart every panel of this, like an ornamental fan, but we stayed in the cottage for 3 weeks only, just 3 weeks, because it was cut short, you see, cut short after just 3 weeks when I left my entire life behind. When Alana was 23, she met Harry, an older man, a truly ruthless, mildly amoral cosmopolitan, and fell in love. Things happened suddenly. She was young then, and also so wound up. They met in April, and in the first bit of mild weather, and in August they went to stay in rural Ireland. It did not end well. 6 years later, when Alana is newly married to another man, she sees the landlady from afar. Memories of those days spent in bliss, then torture, return to her, and the realization that she has been waiting all this time to be rediscovered. A quote from previous winner Sue Rainsford. Campbell writes romantic ambivalence and sexual risk with a sharpness that begs belief. I often laughed out loud, more often still shivered with recognition.
Hello, my name is Neve Campbell, and I'm very honoured to be nominated for a Kate O'Brien Award, not least because I have a lot of admiration for Kate O'Brien as a writer, and it's especially nice to be nominated in her name for that reason. So I'm going to read a small piece from my novel This Happy, which came out in June of 2020. This Happy is the story of the 30-year-old newlywed Alana, who encounters someone from her past on the streets of Dublin and falls down a rabbit hole of rumination about an illicit affair she had with a married man when she was 23, who was also a lot older than her. This man is Harry. And in this scene, Alana is attending the funeral of her grandmother. So this scene is about remembering the past and about making kind of uncanny connections between things within the life of one person, which is Alana, but also within the lives of generations of women in Ireland, and particularly working class women in Ireland. So I have based some of the details on the life of my own grandmother, who had a very hard working life, but who also, I realise now, grew up and lived in a country that was monstrously inhospitable to women. And I am concerned with this theme in my own writing and with experiences that my own generation have now of relative freedom and what to do with what Joyce called the nightmare of history. So I'll start reading in the middle of the chapter. When Mass began, I watched a young demi-cousin twist around and around in her seat, passing an even expression from face to face in the congregation, and observed no adult interrupt or correct her at all. She was a plain child, overweight, at that awkward age of 8 or 9, with puppy breasts already, and her look of curiosity consequently less cute than unnerving. I found myself hoping that she would learn not to do that soon, that she would learn to stop looking openly for trouble in the world. The priest was new and didn't know my grandmother. He gave a kind of self-regarding spiel about death and faith, eyes glazed since he didn't consider these things, the threat of hell, one presumes, or of hubris or something, to apply to him. And I was disappointed for her, mildly affronted for her, although perhaps now she didn't care. Perhaps now it was all the same to her. My grandmother was born, of course, during the war. I used to think that was why she shrouded and choked all the windows of her house in curtains and blinds. She spent most of her day in the kitchen, which had a large window. There were runner blinds, a layer of synthetic net, and 2 columns of crisp velvet curtains that were lined with calico and trailed on the floor like something opulent or ecclesiastical. I used to think, in my primly aspirant schoolchild way, she had grown up in the age of blackout curtains, something like Carrie's War or some other library paperback. But later they told me, in fact, in the 60s, a half-wit neighbour who was known to be a drinker would creep up to kitchen windows at night, kitchens containing housewives, and spy on them. My grandmother was terrified of him. I felt at first that the story was funny and poignant and of course absurd. Why couldn't somebody run him? Why didn't they do anything? But later still, the dry heat seediness of it, the window crusted with fabric, the spoiled sofa of crochet throws like bladder rack, became a kind of idle nightmare, became a teeming metaphor or a mise en abîme, saying something while not saying anything about the condition of women and repression and soft furnishings and sex. My grandmother had been a hosier in her teens. She worked on the factory line. After she was married, she made dresses on commission in her kitchen for other women. She had her wedding reception, she once herself told me, in the parochial hall. They hired a huge Burco boiler to provide sufficient tea. She spent her wedding night on the mailboat to Wales and had her first children, a young wife as I was a young wife now, in Whitechapel. The West Indian women in the council block would not talk to her, she said, and the whole of the block, she insisted, was West Indian. I pictured the erect, indignant woman with her funereal hooded pram, walking up and down and around Whitechapel, far from henwives and hosiery line, with 2 bonneted babies cooing out at her, 2 at least. 3 years in, she could not take the pea soup post-war vibe any longer and took drastic action in what I see at this distance to have been her combative, uncompromising style. She returned to Dublin by herself, leaving the children with some other Irish wife, some other navvy wife. And now, of course, I pictured the erect, indignant woman with a silk scarf at her throat, a pillar box hat, declining food and chat for the 6 hours it would have taken the ferry to get from Holyhead. She returned to her father's house and waited there until her husband relented and followed her. They never left again. Now this life, whose finer details were comic to me, had concluded, and no doubt she was all right with it really, being so old. I knew that I understood her as a kind of brand on history, a seal, a fiery shorthand. None of her sufferings were mine to inhabit. I had so many more freedoms. For her, I was cast out. In the other world, she might look fully at my history and weep. And yet, in the church, I remembered something else. I started and thought of the strangeness and fondness of the recollection, but as I turned it over in my mind, I felt faintly ill. All of these weird things that have become accepted, all of these coincidences arranged and collected and pointing like clues. I was not in Whitechapel when I met Harry, but I was also living in a council block, a post-war block, for crazy rent with 4 other girls. It smelled of bleach always. It smelled like it was trying to conceal some other smell, like a mortuary. A broken gutter caused a gourd of damp in one of the rooms. In the toilet at night, the freezing tiles would twinkle here and there with silverfish. With time, the smell of bleach became gentler and homely. This was, of course, in SE1. It was a room I gave away long before the lease had expired because of Harry. We met in Senate House, Harry and I, at a conference on censorship. I was wearing a short dress with duvet blunt tea roses, and I remember this because I knew as soon as I got to the conference that I had chosen wrong, that it was too short and too cheap looking. It was spring, but there was a merry wind trundling through the courtyard, underneath the mausoleal hood of the entrance to Senate House, out through Bloomsbury, at Cavalry. Oh, and he followed me. I remembered standing in mass, standing for some creed I could not fully remember, the crumbs of other people's muttering. He followed me with the other students through Russell Square and to the Seven Bells or the Admiral or whatever it was. False chalkboards, cheeseburgers, thick steins and pints of beer. And when it got dark, there were bars of heat and blue gaslight in the ribs of parasols outside. And by then, curiously, there was no wind. I must have changed the memory. And yet I see the square, its trees, in perfect stillness like a frieze. That night we rode the motorbike to my flat, to the flat in Borough that I shared with those 4 other girls. Do you know the tabard? I asked. I think so, yes. We'll make like a bird for the tabard, I laughed. I patted his shoulders decorously. Good man, away. You know, I added, it is the very beginning of the Canterbury Tales. Behind the tabard, amidst several 60s tenements, was the block where I lived. We sat on the floor of my room, on an acrylic carpet made to look Persian. All around were clothes and snapped CD cases, books, shoeboxes, junk, jewellery, my bracelets and my brushes and my handless Child of Prague, a christening gift I took with ironic fondness to every digs I rented in. We sat cross-legged in the very centre of that and talked about our lives and writing, and I said afterwards to a friend, I know him, I have known him in another life. Already how he smelled, shoe leather, brush bristles, hay-saving, hops was everything. Then all at once he stood and said, it has been lovely, so lovely, you really cannot know how nice. But you can't go, I cried. I will admit, something like 3 sheets to the wind, but still, my heart began to race. You cannot go, I said. What are you talking about? Stay here. I can't stay here. He stood silhouetted. I had a little lamp. There were only the window and the city and the shard half finished, burning white. To sleep, I corrected. I don't mean sex, just sleep. Well, let's go to sleep. I can't stay here, he said. I have to leave. When I saw that he was serious, a certain vertiginous sense of loss came over me, so disproportionate and so unbearably real. Go then, I answered rashly. You know where the door is. Go. I'm sorry. Go quickly. Just leave. Is life like this? Moments like hinges. And there it is, an image of her back, her pillar box hat, descending erect and indignant down the scored stairwell of a post-war building. An image of his back, alert in the dark but no turning back, descending the scored stairwell of my post-war building. Like a tattoo or a pattern or an archetype, you see. People leave. I'd said to my husband after the argument, I won't stay where I'm not wanted. No, I won't. Although I wasn't really sure if this was true. Harry had left that night in London. On that night I had felt terribly, obscurely terrible, and gone to bed. Even though we'd only just met, and he shouldn't have meant a thing to me, there was, you see, this kind of vertigo from the start. The morning after we met, I got up with a hangover and dressed as usual and went into the Mawn like a normal person, but he had kept my number. He did not text me, he telephoned. As we spoke, I sat in the little garden at the Mawn and sifted gravel with my feet. By my mother in the church, I thought, newly troubled. I've been so broken, so very desperate in my time, haven't I? Unmoored, you might say, adventurous, dangerous. After the Mass, I said, I'm not sure we have time for the burial if you have to get back to work. Let me just say hi to Dad and we'll go to the car. Whatever you like, she replied. She was looking indulgently about her. The dead woman had been unkind to her after all. After my father left, my grandmother came to see my mother with her Eucharist kit. She said, now you must ask for forgiveness.
Rachel Donahue's Temple House Vanishing. Power, jealousy, desire. 25 years ago, a 16-year-old schoolgirl and her charismatic teacher disappeared without trace. When Louisa arrives at Temple House, an elite Catholic boarding school, she quickly finds herself drawn to sophisticated fellow pupil Victoria and their young bohemian art teacher, Mr. Lavelle. The 3 of them form a bond that seems to offer an escape from the repressive regime of the nuns who run the cloistered school, until Louisa and Mr. Lavelle suddenly vanish. Years later, a journalist with a childhood connection to Louisa determines to resolve the mystery. Her search for the truth will uncover a tragic, mercurial tale of suppressed desire and long-buried secrets. It will shatter lives and lay a lost soul to rest. Temple House Vanishing is a stunning, intensely atmospheric novel of unrequited longing, dark obsession, and an unintended consequences. Mike McCormack tells us that the novel's subtle characters and intrigue keep the pages turning.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm going to read from my book, The Temple House Vanishing. The evenings drew in and became cooler, but mostly we chose not to notice. Victoria and I played tennis in the late October afternoons after class, and sometimes for a few minutes before the bell rang, we would just collapse on the damp grass with our school jumpers for pillows. We would stare at the clouds going past and the leaves on the trees golden against the sky. There was always a cool, fresh breeze and the faint taste of salt in the air. I have that sense of technicolor again when I think of it. Those moments of heightened consciousness when you know that this moment right now will be important to remember because it won't last. The birds would soar high above our heads and we took to predicting the weather. If the seagulls came in droves off the cliffs, it meant rain was on the way, and we were almost always right. The mist, though, was harder to foresee. A few wisps at first that you failed to register as anything much except the slight dying of the light. It was only as you stood up, brushing the grass from your jumper, that you would notice the creeping damp on your legs and in the air, wet socks and shoes, and the school would no longer be tall and all-seeing, but blurred and ghostly, its edges rubbed out. Some nights, when the fog was really thick, the foghorn could be heard far off down the coast, a mournful cry, a warning let out into the waves in the night. I found it strangely comforting, like someone else was awake in the dark, watchful and concerned. I slept very little. The room was cold and shadowy, and when it was windy, the heavy, dusty curtains would blow slightly. The windows were old with cracks in the glass, and the wood splintered, with moss growing around the edges of the frame. In the mornings, the entire pane would have condensation on it, and each day I wiped it away with the sleeve of my uniform. It became a morning ritual. Victoria believed in ghosts and in communion with the dead. She told me once that after her favorite aunt had died, she woke up one night and could smell her perfume in her bedroom. It was a particularly romantic and flowery smell, orange blossoms and hyacinth, and not something Victoria would ever wear. She dared not move in the bed. It happened 3 times and then nothing. She wondered had her aunt got bored and just left. She was sure the school was haunted. She thought it was by the dead, but I was more certain it was by the living, with their petty hatreds and awkward, mean desires. They were the shadow that lay on everything.
Elaine Feeney's As You Were. Sinead Hines is a tough, driven, funny young property developer with a terrifying secret. No one knows it, not her fellow patients in a failing hospital, and certainly not her family. She has confided only in Google and a shining magpie. But she can't go on like this, tirelessly trying to outstrip her past and in mortal fear of her future. Across the ward, Margaret Rose is running her chaotic family from her rose gold Nokia. In the neighbouring bed, Jane, rarely but piercingly lucid, is searching for a decent bra and for someone to listen. Sinead needs them both. Bold, tender, and irrepressible, As You Were is about intimate histories, institutional failures, the kindness of strangers, and the darkly present past of modern Ireland. It is about women's stories and women's struggles. It's about seizing the moment to be free. Last year's Kate O'Brien Award winner, Nicole Flattery, described it as utterly singular, thrilling, unpredictable, a continuous pleasure.
Hello to everyone at the Limerick Literary Festival. I am absolutely thrilled and honoured to be shortlisted for the Kate O'Brien Fiction Award for my novel As You Were, honouring Kate O'Brien's marvellous legacy. And congratulations to all the other wonderful shortlisted novels that I read with much joy. And I'm just sad we can't all meet up, but soon. So my novel As You Were is based around a protagonist, Sinead Hines, who is 39 years old and ends up on a hospital ward with a devastating terminal diagnosis. And I'm going to read a section from the beginning of the novel called Pishrogues. And it's a flashback sequence to both when Sinead found out that she was so very gravely ill and she only confides in a magpie, and also it delves into the intrusive voice of her father that also haunts her from her past. Pishrogues. I didn't tell a soul I was sick. Okay, I told a fat magpie. She was the first beating heart I met after the oncology unit, and she sat, shiny and serious, on the bonnet of the Volvo, one for sorrow. And I saluted her with that greeting you give when you find yourself alone and awkward with one magpie, and she flew away, piercing her black arc through the sky blue. An arrow points to you are here, this is okay, breathe. You are just a dot, swirly space, breathe. No one will ever find you. Good, this is a good thing. Thump. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, thump. After saluting Magpie, I sped at 139 kilometres per hour out along the M6. Stone walls hurled past, and end days of August conspired with night, letting a cold dusk down. 39, fitting. On the car's windscreen, a fog was creeping around my eldest son's initials traced inside a fat heart. But I was fine. Father always told me I was fine. So as the years went by, I grew increasingly mistrustful of bad news bearers. Miss Sinead Hines was fine. Father said so. I was fine. I am fine. I will be fine. By Jesus, when I get my hands on her, I'll fucking kill her. I'll throttle her. She's fine. And she pretending to be sick. Truth is, there's nothing at all wrong with her. But there's a lot wrong with that old yo twisted on her back all night, and she didn't even bother to check her, not even throw a quick eye on her. She wouldn't mind a china cup, that one. Where is she? Under here in the cupboard, hot press. Come out, wherever you are. Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell blood. Where in the name of good God is she, leaving an old yo all the night through on her back? Reading books, that bitch, somewhere. She can tell that to the dead animal, so she can. I'll give her books when I get my hands on her. My mother told me to have a hot bath or put on a nice hat if I was having a bad day. When I'd leave home, she'd stand in the doorway and knead the hollow space between my shoulder blades with her knuckles as I slipped past. She'd dip her index finger into the little hole at the feet of Jesus and flick droplets in my wake. He hung on a loose nail by the door, pasty and lean, with bright red drips on his hands and feet, a lined cloth and blue eyes to die for. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Michelle Gallen's Big Girl, Small Town. Other people find Magella odd. She keeps to herself, she doesn't like gossip, and she isn't interested in knowing her neighbour's business. But suddenly everyone in the small town in Northern Ireland where she grew up wants to know all about hers. Since her dad disappeared during the Troubles, she has tried to live a quiet life with her alcohol-dependent mother. She works in the local chip shop, Monday to Saturday, Sundays off, wears the same clothes every day, overalls too small, has the same dinner each night, fish and chips, nuked in the microwave, and binge watches Dallas, the best show ever aired on TV, from the safety of her single bed. She has no friends and no boyfriend, and Magella thinks things are better that way. When Magella's grandmother is murdered, she is unwillingly thrust into the spotlight of our small, gossip-fueled borderlands town. Crippled by her allegiance to her birthplace, stunned by grief, and craving the security of the routines, rights, and the people she knows, Magella must decide which way her path lies. Big Girl, Small Town is a keenly observed, darkly comic debut with a strong political undertones. At its heart is the voice of Magella, a character whose wry humour, astute observations, and emotional imprisonment will stay with you long after the last page. Previous winner Sarah Boehm describes the novel as bawdy yet beautiful, full of everyday tragedy, absurdity, and truth. I grew extraordinarily attached to Magella.
Hi, I'm Michelle Gallen. I'm going to do a short reading for my book, Big Girl, Small Town. And the reading will come from Monday night. One of Magella's regular customers has come in. He's called Jimmy 9 Pints. And before I begin, I have to show you my super cool, can you see my 3D chip bookmark? It's like my favorite thing. Anyway, I'll crack on reading now. So 10 p.m, item 8.4, jokes, repeated jokes. It was already 10 o'clock. Magella knew it was 10 without looking at her watch because Jimmy Ninepence was in. He worked in a chicken rendering factory in Strabane. Marty had explained to Magella that it was Jimmy's job to put his hand up a chicken's hole, grab the guts, twist, wrench, and release the innards into a plastic container for the gizzard harvesters. Every morning at 6, Jimmy would be waiting for the factory bus. Every evening at 7, he'd be into the Wolfhound for the first of his 9 pints of Guinness. Magella knew this because Marty had told her. She'd never met Jimmy outside of the chipper, even though he lived out her granny's direction. 6 nights a week, at 10 on the dot, Jimmy left the pub and called into the chipper for a sausage supper before getting a lift out the road. Jimmy rolled in, well oiled by the 9 pints, and then he plodded over to the counter and laid down a grubby £5 note. A sausage supper, my good woman, a sausage supper. Marty already had the basket down with Jimmy's chips and sausage bubbling furiously in the golden fat. "It's on its way, Jimmy." Magella took Jimmy's £5 note in her hands and rang it in. There was no point asking Jimmy if he wanted anything extra, like a pint of milk or some red sauce, or if he wanted something different, like a chicken burger. Jimmy only wanted his sausage supper. Magella snapped the till shut, which was the trigger for Jimmy's joke. Jimmy shifted his weight, then leaned in closer to the counter. "You want a bit of my sausage?" He wheezed a bit, slapping his hand on the counter, and Magella waited for the usual 5 seconds before replying with the line that Marty had given her 6 years ago. "I'll batter your sausage if you're not careful now." Then Marty joined in with the laughter, for boys a dear, it was some joke now. Big girl, small town. Oh, and amazing chip, 3D chip bookmark.
Marianne Lee's A Quiet Tide is a novel based on the life of botanist Ellen Hutchins. At the time of her death in 1815, 29-year-old Ellen Hutchins had catalogued over 1,000 species of seaweed and plants from her native Bantry Bay. Ireland's first female botanist, Ellen was a major contributor to 19th century scientific discovery. And yet, like so many brilliant women lost in history, it is her personal story that will resonate today. Marianne Lee fuses fact with fiction to imagine Ellen's rich but tormented inner life, repressed by the gender and class confines of her time. Unmarried, childless and sickly, Ellen is considered an unsuccessful woman, dutifully bound to her family's once grand and isolated estate, Ballylickey House. Still, she glimpses a happiness and autonomy she can never quite articulate as she reaches for meaning and expression until the eruption of a long simmering family feud and the rise of Ellen's own darkness, her quiet tide, will conspire to destroy her fragile future. A Quiet Tide is a life examined, a heartbreaking, inspiring story that at last captures the essence and humanity of a long-forgotten Irish woman. Nuala O'Connor described the novel as a beautifully, elegantly written novel about the tangled roots of family and the pursuit of singular passions.
Hi, I'm Marianne Lee. I'm going to do a short reading from my novel, A Quiet Tide, a reimagining of the life of 19th century botanist Ellen Hutchins. Mr. Barry is the captain of the boat that's taking Ellen out collecting plant specimens, and Letty is her dog. Mr. Barry waited by the shore. She climbed in easily now, Letty under her arm. "A fair morning, miss. Where to?" "Whiddy." They pulled away, cutting into the water. Barely any wind. The boat glided across the surface as though on ice. Once out far enough, Mr. Barry steered southwest and they made good progress. She marked the landscape as it passed, mostly low-rising hills of bald rock patched with scrubby vegetation. Here and there a settlement amongst the trees, though quiet as if deserted. Letty jumped from the boat first and turned circles while she waited for Ellen. As the boat pulled out again, leaving them on the strand, Mr. Barry raised an arm in acknowledgement. They'd fish while she worked, collect her before the sun peaked. The wind licked at her hair and face. She stood for a while, listening to the music of the shore, the cheeps and pip-pips of plovers and oyster catchers, the rattling squawks of terns, the gently lapping water. A pale sun glimmered behind the mist. Debris lay scattered across the rocks, thrown up by the sea. Walking down to the water, she undid the thick leather belt around her waist, another cast-off from Jack, and rebuckled it, securing her hoisted dress and petticoat. She folded her gloves in the bottom of the bag and began her way down the beach, just beyond the waterline, looking down as she went. Rolling her sleeves as far up as they would go, she pulled out her knife and plunged her hand in. By now she was used to the cold water. She no longer thought in terms of seaweed or wrack. Rather, she categorized the amorphous, undulating plants that grew under the water, exposed by tide or tossed onto the beach by storms, according to the genus Fucus, in all its varieties, each differing in colour, habit and function, though connected as members of a family were. Tugging on a clump, she slipped. She windmilled her arms, but still fell with a cry and a splash. She found her footing, stood up. The bottom of her dress was soaked, her sleeves up to the elbows. She held up her skirts, stumbled onto the shingle and padded further up the rocks, dripping as she went. Here, strewn across her path, lay a specimen she'd not seen before. She squatted, forgetting the damp around her legs, and seized it, turning it over, focusing her eyes across its parts, midrib, fronds, curiously waved edges. The fructifications resembled those of Fucus hippoglossum. Stupendous look, the pods burst before her gaze, displacing the seeds either side of the rib. Yes, it greatly resembled hippoglossum, though larger, and a particular red colour, like aged claret. She released her skirts to flap in the wind with a sound like beating wings. She laid out the specimens in a circle, placing her last discovery at the centre, and found a flat rock to sit where she rested, making notes and sketching. Fumbling for a pencil, her fingers closed instead on the wrapped oatcake. Letty roused herself from where she'd been napping and came over to stare. "Are you hungry?" Ellen said. "Of course you are, as always." The dog's ears pricked to her voice. Her head tilted to one side as she considered her chances. Ellen threw her half. "Don't tell Kate." Letty swallowed the cake in 2 long gulps and licked around her mouth and jaws for crumbs. Ellen got to her feet and scrambled around the shingle, wrapping the partly dried fuki in newspaper. "Miss Hutchins, is it?" She whipped upright. A bantry man she knew, Michael Murphy, with a woman and 3 children behind him on the rocks, his family. The woman had a basket strapped to her back. "Good morning, Mr. Murphy." "The weather's holding," he said cautiously. He had a bluff, good-natured face. "That it is. Will it brighten later, do you think?" "Quiet, Letty." The dog had stiffened, growling. At Ellen's voice, she stopped. Mr. Murphy looked into the sky. "There's a breeze might lift it." He nodded in the general direction of Ballylickey. "Mrs. Hutchins as well? Mr. Hutchins?" "Very well. Are these your children?" "Yes, miss." "You're lucky to have so much help." "I am." Mrs. Murphy stayed at a distance. Her hair, loose and uncovered, the colour of pale rust, blew around her head. She might not speak English as well as her husband, if at all. The children clustered near their father, watching Ellen with naked curiosity. Their feet were bare. "Are you collecting wrack, miss?" "Yes," she said. "They say you're interested in it." "I am." He scrunched up his eyes as though this were a great mystery. "And what would you be collecting wrack for, if I might be so bold?" She remembered her bare hands and rummaged in the bag for her gloves, feeling her way under the paper. There are educated men, in Ireland and England, who have need of specimens. Do they pay? No, no, she smiled. I send one sample of each, dried, with the seeds if I can find them attached. Drying fuki had proven another challenge, though less tedious than using the box of sand. Once home, she floated each plant in a large, shallow dish of water to extract the salt, separating and expanding the delicate branches. She could then slide a stiff piece of writing paper into the water underneath and remove it slowly so that the plant remained in its expanded state. After trial and error, she'd worked out the pressure necessary to apply the blotting paper and weights, then how to preserve the sample on paper, suspended in all its beauty and colour as though still under water. Before she could explain some of this to Mr. Murphy, he said, "For what purpose?" "Well, for examination and study, to understand how a plant connects to the rest of the natural world. For example, to learn how it," she paused, about to say, "reproduces. To learn how it thrives, or why it does not." Ah! A dismissive sound, unbelieving. He stared beyond her at the sea. "They just grow, miss, as and how they will, as they've always done." "Certainly, but they still teach us something about how plants generally prosper or fail." "They're wild, miss, God-given. It's for him to know the workings of his creation." "Of course." She stepped forward in her eagerness to explain. "But having created the world, would God not want us to appreciate it? Have you never wanted to know how a thing functioned? A desire to understand why it does what it does? And if you did understand, might it not assist you in your dealings?" His face creased in polite concentration. "If you say so, miss." The children continued to squint at her, open-mouthed. No doubt they knew more about the tides, the weather, the landscape, than she would in a lifetime. She felt suddenly foolish. Flushing, she pulled on her gloves, forced a smile. "You're gathering wrack for the fields." "If we're not disturbing you, miss." "Of course not." The children now looked out to sea. She followed their gaze. The boat had come into view. The sun was almost overhead, the morning spent. "I must get home, Mr. Murphy. I wish you good day." "Good day to you, miss." Ellen nodded at his wife and got a tip of the head in return. Her face remained blank. Ellen walked away as briskly as she could manage across the deep shingle, towards the waiting boat.
Alice Lyons' Una is a novel written without the letter O. Una stays downstairs making models. Upstairs her mother is in bed. Carers and visitors hover like sentinels, unexplained to the daughter who must be shielded. Una does not know it yet, but she is an artist in the making. She never feels right in the affluent suburban culture of first-generation immigrants in New Jersey, where conspicuous consumption and white privilege prevail. In the aftermath of her mother's death, silence takes hold inside her. Her inner life goes into a deep freeze. Emotionally hobbled, she has her first encounters with sex and drugs and endures the trials of adolescence. The world of painting and art provides a panorama that allows her to escape the claustrophobia of small-town urban farms. It takes her to New York, Massachusetts, and ultimately Ireland. This novel gives voice to a female character on her fraught journey into adulthood and charts her evolution as an artist. Her adolescent numbness is thawed through contact with the physical world, the materials of painting, and her engagement with Irish community, culture, and landscape. From 70s East Coast America to rural Ireland amidst the transformative awkwardness of the Celtic tiger, Una is a resonant story conveyed in an innovative form. Irish Times reviewer Sarah Gilmartin describes it as an impressive feat for a new author whose style perversions are not simply meant to dazzle, but rather to reflect the recurring themes of her book. What we destroy by trying to omit parts of our life or parts of ourself is a central focus of Una, told in the first person in 99 short titled sections that blend prose and poetry. The book is an intriguing, innovative take on one woman's journey to find herself.
Hi, I'm Alice Lyons, and I'm going to read from my book Una, which I'm delighted to learn is shortlisted for the Kate O'Brien Award. So Una is a novel, and the protagonist, who's Una, is from New Jersey, but she moves to rural Ireland. And part of the trope of the book is that Una is, as a person, is quite limited and quite out of touch with herself because of the early loss of her mother in a very traumatic way. And so the book is written without the letter O, which comprises half of her name. And I'm going to read you just a short chapter, a short excerpt from chapter 48, where she first arrives in County Leitrim. Leitrim had a nice ring. It had hills, a busy river, the Black Pig's Dyke between here and fabled up there, the many tales, them and us, the Ra, kidnapped nags, Armalites, Gelignite, Semtex. It all huddled in the gentle hills and wet, reed-filled fields. I pedaled the hired bike a summer day, left Leitrim village, heading where I hadn't a clue. I was transgressing the map, pushing its limits. The way was quiet, nettled, and bramble-fringed. Buildings were sparse. Farmers meandered in distant fields, staring vaguely at me as my hired bike ticked by. A few steep hills had me standing, panting and pedaling hard. Then I was freewheeling, and the village unveiled itself like a quick tidal sequence as I passed. Sheds with neat turf stacks, wild fields and recently cut fields, silage bales tightly wrapped in black plastic painted with white, chalky, bird-frightening graffiti, laundry lines with pegged underthings and tracksuits, brightly painted walls, electric wire fences, beech hedges, cypress hedges, habitable dwellings, large and small, scattered here and there. The village was empty at the center, just a green triangular field in it with cattle whining. The white pebble-dashed church at the field's end dwarfed everything else, even Murphy's pub and market, with Weetabix and Ender Rat cakes stacked in a farmer-friendly display. I asked inquisitive, massive-headed Jim behind the till if he had ice cream, and he sure did, Magnum Classics. I leaned with the bike against the pimply, pebble-dashed church wall, baking in rare, full sunshine, licked up the ice cream, licked the stick, and stuck it in the bin. Passing the bridge, I saw a place with a Farrell's estate agent's sign in the garden, sniffed the river air, and cycled a few miles up where the main Dublin carriageway intersected. I turned back, re-sniffed the river, passed the Farrell's sign again. Halt, I heard myself say. Halt and think and see. The place faced the river. It was sturdy and single and cleanish. I rapped the skinny glass pane beside the entry, was admitted by an Englishman. He had lived there just a few years. Packy McGuigan had built the place in 1948. The inside was bright and airy. Sun streamed in the big west-facing glass. The side garden was bee-lilaced. It had a little yodel burner. I'd gather sticks. It'd be warm. It was a place to begin. It was a beginning place.
So, as you can imagine, after that, it was extremely difficult to decide on a winner from such talent and difference. Thank you to my fellow judges, Eileen O'Connor, Marie Hackett, Niall McMonigal, and Donal Ryan. We were all taken on numerous, exciting, and inspirational journeys. The Kate O'Brien Award is for a novel of excellence, one which does something innovative with language and ideas, and the powerful, poignant and deeply moving novel, As You Were by Elaine Feeney, is our very worthy winner for 2021.
Hello to everybody at the Limerick Literary Festival. I am absolutely thrilled and a little shocked to be awarded the Kate O'Brien Prize for As You Were. So thank you hugely to the judging committee and to everyone at the Literary Festival. I am delighted to be awarded a prize that honours the legacy of a writer like Kate O'Brien, who pushed forward and broke ground and was heavily censored and came up against many obstacles. And I suppose in a way broke ground for novels like As You Were to be published, and the novels of the shortlistees. I was very delighted and quite proud to be on a shortlist with such stellar novels, debut novels, and I would like to wish all the best in future writing and future endeavours to Alice and to Marianne and to Rachel and Neve and to Michelle, and to wish them also congratulations. Huge thank you to my wonderful editor, Kate Harvey at Harville Secker, and my publicist, Mia at Vintage, and to my great agent, Peter. This novel wouldn't have come about without them, but it more particularly wouldn't be a novel at all without readers. So I'm hugely grateful and hugely thankful to all the readers of the novels to date. It's been a very strange year, and I just hope that the Shoots of Spring will offer maybe some hope to everybody, and wish you all the very best. I am absolutely thrilled, so thank you again.